All right, hi everybody. My name's Amy Wolf. I am the programming coordinator for the Osterville Village Library. It's nice to see you all on a very cold Friday, but to kick off our holiday stroll for Osterville. Thank you so much for being here. We were blessed a couple of months ago to get this suggestion from women's group member Wendy Dawson, who is relative. I believe it's her cousin, Anthony Reed, and with him he has brought Brianne Cassetta from the Frederick Olmsted Historic Site in Brookline. What a drive it must have been this morning, but we are so glad that you made the trek to the Osterville Village Library. So without further ado, I bring you the Frederick Olmsted, the father of landscape architecture, presentation today.
Thank you all so much for being with us this morning. As Amy said, I'm Brianne Cassetta. I'm a supervisory ranger at Olmsted National Historic Site. I manage all of the public-facing work that we do, so visitors, education, partnerships, that type of thing.
My name is Anthony Reed, cousin to Wendy Dawson, local celebrity hero. I'm an archivist at the Frederick Olmsted National Historic Site, and I'm on the curatorial crew. I'm one of the younger staff. I've been only been there 23 years. So I'm the junior staffer there. My other two colleagues in the curatorial division have been there sort of 32 years. So it's a great gig. And we work with the curatorial material, the archives. We'll take a little on the second half of the program at my side of the house. But in the meantime, we're in there.
So we're gonna get started. Please feel free. We'll have time for questions at the end, but please feel free to interrupt us at any point. This feels very formal, very official. But please feel free to raise your hand if you have any questions or want any clarification. Happy to make this more conversational as we talk about the Olmsteds of Brookline, landscapes and legacies. So the Olmsted legacies, and we have to pluralize that, are vast, and so we're going to talk a little bit about them, but more kind of as the Olmsteds, and we have to pluralize that as well because it's not just senior. And so as we get into the history of the site and the family and the firm, we'll see that the expansive history really does hit many generations. So something that all generations of the Olmsteds have in common, and something that we try to carry forward. Best laid plans that it's not going to move forward. Oh, there we go. It's like I'm hitting every button. So early on in his life, Olmsted's born in 1822, and pretty early on in his life, Olmsted states that he wants to make himself useful in the world, to make happy, to advance the condition of society. This is his overall goal. He has no idea how to do that, but he tries a lot of ways. And so as we think about not only what's useful, but also how society changes, Olmsted's trying to kind of manage these two worlds, figuring out how he as an individual can be useful, but also what's happening in the society at the time. So Olmsted's early life starts in Hartford, Connecticut. He is a native New Englander. He is not a rags to riches story. The Olmsted family is one of the founding families of Hartford, Connecticut. So they go way back in history there, but very much grows up in that New England sensibility, heavily influenced by his father. John Olmsted is one of the really stalwarts of the community in Hartford. He is a merchant. He runs the major store there, but also he's very much involved with what he thinks is societal good. So working on not only to improve the town, but on donating money and goods and his time to these charities and to these works that are trying to improve the condition of society for their community. Olmsted's father is also very much involved in just getting his kids out into the scenery of New England. And so they take many trips. And so even though Olmsted's senior grows up in Hartford, Connecticut, a lot of his childhood is influenced by the travels that they take throughout all of New England. They go to the Finger Lakes region of New York, and they travel quite a bit. Olmsted's father really understanding, as he talks about the value of the scenic on the mind. So Olmsted's father is also, Olmsted's wife, Mary, calls him doting. I would maybe choose a word, that Olmsted Senior is very spoiled by his father, doting in like the best way possible. And so his father continues to play an influence on his life much later on in life than you might necessarily expect. So as Olmsted's growing up with his father, he's affording him every opportunity. He has a lot of different opportunities for formal schooling. Some of them are with school marms when he's a little bit younger that are just loving, and they just want to encourage his creativity. And then he has more of a harsh experience when he is sent to a school run by a particular pastor, and he experiences some abuse, both physical and mental. And so he kind of goes, his life with schooling varies, and it's very much a roller coaster. And for Olmsted, sets him up for a time not really to love school. Loves to learn, he loves to read, he's heavily influenced by the work that he's doing, but he's not looking for formal schooling. He never feels like that is the place where he lives. So the school is influencing him, as are his friends. So Senior, Olmsted Senior is the one not looking at the camera. His brother John is right above him. And so not only is he growing up with his father, who has this very civic mindset, but his friends and the group of the men that he associates with have this civic mindset. Some questionable decisions are made by some of his friends about how they carry that forward. But this is their idea, is moving this society, moving this great these spaces that they consider great to make them even better. While Olmsted, at the time that he is ready to go to university, his father is ready to send him to Yale on one of his jaunts out into the wilderness. He contracts poison sumac to his eyes. And so under the doctor's recommendation to not have vigorous study because it will stress out his eyes even more, he decides that he's not going to go to university. I call foul with that because his job, right? The job that he takes on after that, instead of going to university, is he becomes and studies surveying. And last time I checked, he did really good eyesight for surveying. So I think it was just a convenient excuse, but
doctor's note. Please excuse for
exactly. That's an ask for gun history. That's my personal take, but Olmsted does still love to learn, and so as all of his friends are going to Yale, he will just show up and he just audits classes. He just sits in and he talks to professors that are interesting to him. The second they stop being interesting, he stops going to class because he's not a student. So this is really how he's a self-taught individual. Having all of these opportunities afforded by his father allow him to have these experiences. He is an avid reader, and a lot of the reading that he does is of landscape theorists of the time. John Ruskin and Thomas Carlyle are two of the ones here. I pulled these quotes because they really remind me of the quote that Olmsted himself had about being useful, trying to figure out what your place is in the world. And so Olmsted is reading these theorists, not only about societal change, but also specifically landscapes in the spaces that they're in. So he is technically uneducated, and he tries his hand at surveying. It's not really for him. His father sets him up with a job in New York at a merchant there, friend of his. Olmsted is not really satisfied sitting still. And he sees the ships coming in and out of the port of Manhattan and is tempted to get onto a ship himself. At the age of 21, he's about 5-6 years older than most of the ship boys who would be running the decks. He marches up to a ship and says, "I want to go to China." And they take him on. Sure. Why not? Come on in. So for about a year, he travels on a ship to China. Terrible conditions. Horrible experience. He's seasick probably about 85% of the time. To the point where he sends a letter thinking that he's like, this is it. This is it. I can't do it anymore. So when he's on the ship, he gets off the ship in China for just 3 days. So about a 15-month boat excursion off the ship for only 3 days. That's not good. So it's this. He's really trying to figure out what is it that I am doing. When he comes back and he knows that he wants to do something, his father's like, "Okay, well, what do you want to do?" And so he's like, "I'm going to be a farmer." Next on his list. And so his father says, "Okay, great, I'll buy you a farm in Connecticut." Olmsted doesn't like the farm in Connecticut, so his father ends up buying him a farm in Staten Island. So Olmsted is not looking to be a farmer in the traditional sense. Something that Olmsted's looking for is his influence. He writes a lot about his experiences on the ship. He notices how the captain on the ship was incredibly ruthless. He was abusive. And so Olmsted saw people standing up to him and saw people taking voice and kind of activating the opportunity to rebel against the captain of the ship. And so Olmsted thinks, well, I have a voice and I can contribute. What can I contribute? So when he sets up his farm in Staten Island, he sets up a scientific farm. The idea being that he's going to research the best types of farming techniques. So irrigation and cross-pollination. What kind of crops can you grow? And so his goal is to become a scientific farmer and then write about it, because this is now how he's going to be useful. People are farming, they need to know best techniques. He's going to support that. This is one of the earliest drawings of the farmhouse in Staten Island. It is assumed that it is in Olmsted's own hand. No actual proof of that, but we can assume that this is one of the earliest drawings that Olmsted makes in his career. That he has here. And he's really, while he's here, this is his opportunity and his first time working with the land. He has experienced different types of landscapes. He's experienced the effect that they have on him. He's very aware of the space around him. So even when he's off the ship in China for those 3 days, he notes how the city feels, how the buildings, around him, how people move through those spaces. He's really aware of the space around him and how that impacts him as an individual. And so as he's here in Staten Island, he is looking for an opportunity to create a space that works for him in this way. But being one to not sit still for very long, Olmsted is kind of looking for the next adventure. His brother, John, completely different, straight arrow, goes to Yale, becomes a doctor. This is what he's going to do. But like some, can't talk about anything, I didn't do it, but like many college graduates, John is looking for an opportunity to travel. And so John heads to England for a walking tour after his graduation from Yale. And so Olmsted is very jealous because his last overseas adventure did not go so well. And so he writes a letter to his dad asking him to also, if he could also go. And his dad says no. Says absolutely not. I bought you a farm. You're a farmer. Stay where you are. And so Olmsted writes back to his father. He says, well, here's the deal. John is so much younger. He's 2 years younger. So he needs a chaperone, obviously. And then he also says, it's a work trip. I will be a better farmer if you send me, because England has been farming longer than us. So I can study their techniques, bring them back, and then I will be a better farmer. So it's actually worth your investment to pay for my trip because I'm going to make more money as a farmer. Doting father sends him to, right? Just like, tell my mom that story. Yeah.
Good luck to you.
And so he leaves his farm in Staten Island and travels with John and their good friend, Charlie Brace, to England, and they take a walking tour. And Olmsted is struck and very heavily influenced by the English countryside. And we'll see this in some of his designs later on. As they're walking, he really does study farming. He really does talk to people. But one of the things that he's really taken by and really inspires his next couple of steps is when he visits Liverpool, heavily industrialized city. During the Industrial Revolution, blows up to have all of these factories taking over the city. Right across the water from Liverpool is a small hamlet of Birkenhead. And Birkenhead has the first public park funded by the government in the country. And this is Birkenhead Park, designed by Joseph Paxton. And when Olmsted visits Birkenhead Park, he writes back to his father that he can't understand why in democratic America there is not an equivalent to this People's Garden. It is fully funded by the government. It is open to the public. And Olmsted's really struck by this concept, but also the people who are in this heavily industrialized city have access to this space just for the purpose of access to open space. Like, there is no other reason for this park to be there other than people can't leave and go to the countryside that he has been able to visit. And so they bring that into the city. During 2021, we had the team, I don't know, COVID runs together. the team from Birkenhead Park did a presentation for our staff. They are currently working on a proposal to be considered a World Heritage Site. And currently on World Heritage sites, there is not a World Heritage Site that is a landscape for the sake of being a landscape. So both Birkenhead Park and Central Park are up for consideration, and the hope is that both of them, because they're so heavily connected to each other. So Olmsted is traveling, he comes back and he takes all of his letters and he takes all of his journal entries and he turns them into a book to publish. I had to pull this image. There's a lot of images of the cover or the title page of this book, but they spelled his name wrong. They put an A in it. There is no A in Olmsted. So I just like that one because it was funny to me.
And I'll say, both of us as graduates of the California school system.
Also love it's University of California. Great way to spell author's name wrong. Yeah. So Olmsted decides he's going to write. He's going to take all of his ideas because as a scientific farmer, he's already been contributing to magazines and to periodicals about farming. And so this is just his way of putting all of his ideas into one selection. Walks and Talks of an American Farmer in England. Mild public success, but is well regarded critically. I don't know why. I can barely get through Olmsted's own writing. He's one of those people that when you can use 5 words, he'll use 15 just because, but really well regarded critically. And so it sets him up for his next adventure because at the time that he is publishing, it's also around the time that Uncle Tom's Cabin is published. And so we're in the 1850s at this point, and the idea of slavery and what's happening between the North and the South is really coming to a head. And so Olmsted, as a Northerner, is anti-slavery. He is an abolitionist. He is not out there with the rallying cry. He is not out there leading anything. This is just by the nature of who he is and how he's grown up, this is what his views are. But he's also proven himself to be a pretty good author. And so he's hired by the New York Times to travel to the South and write an objective viewpoint, series of articles on the economics of slavery. The New York Times is not looking for personal accounts. They are not looking for the horrors of slavery. That has been well documented. The New York Times hired him to look specifically at the impact on the economic and landscape of the South. So Olmsted does that for the most part, and really does that. He argues that, the enslavement of people does not work economically. You are ruining your landscape by planting the same crops year after year with absolutely no diversity. But as he moves through, as he gets later on, and then he leaves the New York Times and takes his writings to publish a series of 3 books, and then later an anthology called The Cotton Kingdom, he really starts to take on a bigger, broader view of this. He writes about the horrors of slavery. He writes about what he sees and what he experiences. He also writes about how in the South, they spend so much money on embellishing their own homes and on having the fanciest dresses, and everything is very personal. And yet, and I apologize if anyone from the South, I'm paraphrasing Olmsted, he talks about how it's uncultured because there is no investment in public libraries. There is no investment in schools. There is no investment. It's all about that personal, I have this. And I have this becomes this superiority complex that I also have the right to own people. And so Olmsted's really looking at this in a way, and he writes, let me get I have my quote. Oh, and he writes in The Cotton Kingdom, we had to subjugate slavery or be subjugated by it. And so he's pushing for and starts to stretch that abolitionist muscle a little bit more as with the publishing of The Cotton Kingdom. So now he's a writer. Farm is in Staten Island, hasn't been there in a couple of years, but now he's a writer. This is what he's doing. And so he decides that he wants to take a hand at publishing. And so he partners with George Putnam to start a publishing company. He has no money. His number one investor is his dad. His dad invests in his publishing company, and this is what they're going to do. Unfortunately, while he might be a successful writer, semi-successful farmer, he is not a great businessman and ends up bankrupting their publishing house. Great ideas though, and Putnam Monthly, is that what it's called? Putnam Monthly? Yeah. Starts out really looking to have different voices represented within their publishing house. Has no aspirations for what's next, doesn't really know, and his dad pretty much calls him out on it and says, I'm done, you need to figure out what you are doing. It's not uncommon in today's society or today's world to have someone in their mid-30s, like, I don't know what I'm doing, I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna try that, you know, trying to figure all of that out. Olmsted comments on how he's living a perfectly restrained vagabond life.
Supported by his dad.
Supported by his dad. He's restrained, he's also vagabond. So he is publishing the last edition of his book, and he is, you know, connections, finds out that they are hiring a superintendent for a new park to be built in New York. So New York City at the time is building rapidly. It is expanding. The amount of people coming into Manhattan in particular is growing at a rate that really they can't sustain. And so New York decides to pause and figure out how they can better the city, because they are seeing hordes of people. This is a political cartoon of the time, and it's cholera coming over from Europe and New York City. And then you can see on the belt of the Trojan, Spartan, something, science. So science is sleeping on the fact that cholera is coming over. So New York City is not prepared because so many people are coming together. Public health becomes a real crisis. And so I think one of the ways to combat this is to have open space, to have accessible fresh drinking water, to have a dairy, to have these kind of things as public services. And so they have a plan for a park in New York City. And so Olmsted is hired as the superintendent of the park. He is hired to carry out the design that has already been selected. And so he oversees a team of men clearing the land, oversees the work that is laid out for him. People aren't thrilled with the plan, so they ended up hosting an open competition, and a man by the name of Calvert Vaux, whose photo I couldn't find, even though I have a million of them. Calvert Vaux approaches Olmsted to design a plan for Central Park together. No matter what, Olmsted is going to carry out the plan. So Vaux thinks he's a great partner. Vaux is a classically trained architect, so has that design ideals, but Olmsted knows the land. He knows what can happen. And so together they submit the Greensburg plan. This is Olmsted's very first landscape architecture project. Not a bad one to start with. And Olmsted takes all of his life experiences thus far and tries to figure out how this can improve the conditions. He's so clued into landscape, he's clued into society, he's clued into how these spaces feel, that he and Vaux create this opportunity for people to move through this space and lose the fact that you are in a city. How many of you have been to Central Park? Minus some of the buildings, and I know they have the shadow rules and all of that kind of stuff for air rights, but it does really have that separation of that space. One of the key reasons that they won the contest, there were about 30 applicants to the contest. One of the key reasons is that they were able to figure out how to move carriage traffic underneath the park, so that you could go on throughout the park and never experience that stress of the city. And so that was one of the things that they were really looking for in their park design. But open space, fresh water, like I said, the dairy is there, opportunities for people to experience the pastoral, those open landscapes that Olmsted saw in England, throughout the large parade grounds and playgrounds, the open spaces, the meadows, but also this picturesque landscape style. The Ramble in Central Park is a great example of this overly planted experience of being out in the forest. Those wilderness trips that he took as a young boy, Olmsted sees value in that as well, and so puts areas like that into Central Park. The New York Public Library had a great exhibit of the plans that didn't win, probably about 10 years ago, but you can still find them online. They're fascinating. I encourage you all to check them out because they're really cool. There's
very formal,
very
French style, laid out parterres with the not at all like what the New York would be.
All like the circle, you know, the circles of the topiaries and the rose gardens. It's very different. So these two landscape styles, so you have this green swath in the middle of a city. This is obviously modern, but you know, you get the picture of how it would have taken up the space. Olmsted also argues for the expansion of Central Park, understanding that the city is going to grow. So if you take the entire island of Manhattan, you wanted it to be central, so it was only just the lower half that was there. So Olmsted argues for even more acreage because the city will continue to grow past that. And so here in the Ramble, you kind of have an example of the mix of the overly planted and then out into the view shed of more of this open space, the water, and having this experience moving through the landscape for physical health, for mental health, and then for community health. And Olmsted was looking at community health, particularly he writes about people coming together and being seen coming together. And for Olmsted, that was a really important point that he wanted to bring up, was that it wasn't just about, you know, everyone can use this space, but everyone can use the space at the same time. And so that you're understanding that your worldview or the really siloed world that you might live in, there are other silos. Silos can all open up and come into the same space. He's not an idealist. He doesn't think people are going to all of a sudden become best friends, but now your worldview is more open. But this was just a project. This is just a checklist for Olmsted. Moving on. He is, while he's not a good businessman, he's a terrible politician. And you know, the nepotism and favoritism of the day get in the way. Olmsted's reporting to people that he thinks have no business being in government, no business telling him what to do. And it's also at this time that the Civil War breaks out. Now, Olmsted's in his early 40s. He had a carriage accident in Central Park. He walks with a limp. He is not an ideal soldier, but he wants to serve. He wants to figure out how he can do his part. So Olmsted becomes the secretary of the United States Sanitary Commission.
As one does after a career.
He's such a good administrator. I don't know what you're talking about. And the U.S. Sanitary Commission, he works directly under President Lincoln. And the goal of the Sanitary Commission is to create sanitary environments in camps, hospitals, and that sort of thing. In the early years of the Civil War, more men were dying because of unsanitary conditions, because of disease, because of the inability to treat wounds. And so Olmsted is looking to combat that. Olmsted is looking to, how do we create this opportunity for people at home to donate, to send goods, to send food, for farms to come together, and instead of just saying, oh, we're from Massachusetts, so our donations are only going to go to Massachusetts troops, or we're from Connecticut, and that was the early model, is that I'm going to send food and I'm going to send goods to the people who I know. And Olmsted says, we're all in this together, we're doing it together. And so he centralized this idea, centralized doctors working together, centralized the nursing crew, hospital, you know, commandeering ships to become hospital ships to more easily expedite people from battlefields up back to the north. Again, Olmsted is a terrible politician. His writings on Lincoln are really interesting. He either reveres him and writes very positively about him, and then you can tell when he's not happy about his leadership because he talks about how wrinkled and tired he looks. I'm like, well, there's Civil War, like, can't blame him for that one. Again, he gets really frustrated with how bureaucratic this becomes. And he loses his the advocates that he started this with, and so he gives up on the East Coast completely and he heads west. He becomes the president of a gold mine. What else can I do? So Olmsted is out in California at Mariposa Valley Mining Company, where his goal here is that he wants to create a family-friendly mining community. At the time, there are just a lot of individual young men who were there, and as individual young men do, got into a lot of trouble, and there was a lot of drinking and gambling and not the best conditions. And so he goes in to set up some rules. Lay down, fix stuff.
Wild West.
Wild West, exactly. He does bring his family with him. Like, this is all, we're all in at this point. And so while he's there, he travels quite a bit, and he gets invited to participate in the Colfax Party. And the Colfax Party was run by the Speaker of the House, Representative Colfax, to investigate Yosemite Valley and the Mariposa Grove. And so they have a whole bunch of people, and once again, not looking at the camera, Frederick Olmsted is second in from the left on the very bottom. And so Olmsted is asked, because of his writing background, to write the report that comes out of this fact-finding mission. President Lincoln does take a break from the Civil War and creates Yosemite Valley as the first federally protected land in the country. So while Yellowstone has the distinction of being the first national park, Yosemite is the first time that the federal government comes in and says, you cannot do anything to this. So that was in 1864. They spent about a year trying to figure out what to do with it. And so in 1865, Frederick Olmsted reads aloud his findings in the Yosemite Valley and Mariposa Grove report. These are two quotes that I pulled from that, thinking through that the capacity, the subsequent capacity for happiness and the means of securing happiness. Olmsted thinks that there is, the right to pursue happiness is tied to access to places like this. And he talks about how it's the main duty of government, if not the sole duty of government, to provide means to protections for all its citizens in the pursuit of happiness. So Olmsted sees places like this as something that should be protected because this is what makes us people. This is what makes us happy. Olmsted's report is put into a drawer for about 60 years. It is too expensive. It also, he writes about the sublime landscape, these landscapes that you could not even imagine creating. And so we're going to take a little detour off of the chronological order we're kind of heading in. But one of the reasons that Olmsted's report is stuck in a drawer is because it's so tied to his East Coast background. It's so tied to what he saw in Central Park and what he saw in the Civil War, that you need these places to care for people. You need these places to care for yourself. And this was not about, and he ties it to his walks in England and the countryside and how places like this should exist. And that doesn't align with the American exceptionalism. That doesn't align with, John Muir and Teddy Roosevelt sitting around and this campfire myth saying, oh, you know what we should do? We should protect these places. That's 5 years after Olmsted submits his report, that they actually head out to Yosemite. And so it also has this overlying, hint of like, we have to gift this to the people. Here John Muir and Teddy Roosevelt with John Muir bearded, Teddy Roosevelt mustache, these strong white men gifting this to the country. And so Olmsted doing this in the midst of the Civil War as a proponent of democratic space with these Eastern ideals, things don't work. So no one wants to hear from him on this. So it becomes a real shift, and we advocate for Olmsted to be in the line with the Teddy Roosevelts and the John Muirs, but very often in National Park Service history, he is left out because it didn't work with what they were trying to create as the origin story. Sorry, I'm gonna step off my soapbox now. And so as Olmsted is now done, guess what? Goes bankrupt. Mine goes bankrupt. Calvert Vaux has never left the East Coast. Calvert Vaux is stuck with Central Park. This is what he's working on. And he's consistently writing Olmsted letters to come back to New York because Manhattan and Brooklyn had not incorporated into New York City yet. And so Brooklyn had their own money for a park, and they wanted to create something, and they wanted to do it with Vaux. He submitted a plan. Vaux knew in his heart that it could be better and asked Olmsted to come back, multiple letters inviting him back to the East Coast. Olmsted finally agrees, and together they create a plan for Prospect Park. Central Park, Prospect Park, and we're gonna get to, and I'm not taking up your time, am I, Anthony? Okay. Are really where Olmsted gets to stretch his design muscles. Prospect Park a little bit more, you can even just tell in the shape of it. Manhattan was already laid out in a grid. Brooklyn was not yet laid out in its same pattern. So just even in the shape of the park, Olmsted has a little bit more of that ability. But again, he is addressing a need at a particular time. When he's working with Prospect Park, he's coming out of the Civil War. He's creating more of this space for people to come together. He's creating more of this opportunity to community build. Calvert Vaux writes about their design as democratic ideals in trees and dirt. So this is really trying in an attempt to bring people together. Olmsted himself talks about how physically, as people move closer together, particularly in city centers, spiritually they move apart. I always tell this to my husband. I'm like, I love you so much. If I had one more year in COVID, like You would have to find a different house. Because when you live with someone or with people all the time, you don't have the choice to opt into a relationship. Like, you are forced to do so. And so working in factories, living in tenements, people were just with each other all the time. And so Olmsted's like, if you give them physical space, they can choose to have those relationships. They can choose to develop that. And having that authority and having that power is really impactful for individuals and then as a community as a whole. So at this point, he's stuck with it. Takes the term landscape architect and runs with it. This is the first time formalizing that title of landscape architect. Olmsted is in it. I promise you no more detours. He's doing it. And so Olmsted himself with Prospect Park is really looking at the city development, but he's still working within the city boundaries. And so he and Vox continue to partner for a few years. They're always remaining friends, but he does eventually go out on his own and to work on a variety of projects. His projects change. The project up in the upper left-hand corner is the first park system designed in Buffalo. That is a Vox and Olmsted project. At that time, Olmsted called Buffalo the best designed city in the world because it had this park system running through it. Cherokee Park down in the just underneath that. Riverside was an early adaptation of the suburban design. Again, you can see a lot of those natural curves, pocket parks, green space throughout that. Riverside outside of Chicago, Illinois. And then one of Olmsted's very first solo projects is the plan for the United States Capitol building.
Yeah, not a bad start.
Not a bad start. As he's gaining notoriety, Olmsted is working all across the country. So his love of travel, his love of diversity of projects, he's always being kept busy, but always thinking about how these different projects are necessary to make the condition of society better. So designing the Capitol grounds, he is looking at how do you exemplify the foundation of this nation, this idea of people, you know, this is the root of it. Coming out of the Civil War, he wants to make it look strong, look stately. So everything, can't tell in the flat picture, but it's, you know, it's a hill. So all of the pathways, all the plantings are designed so that you showcase the building, that there is strength to the building. So Olmsted in his later life is really well established, and it's here in Brookline, in Massachusetts, at his home in Fairstead, that you see his maturity and kind of this shift into this next generation of landscape architects. Olmsted moves to Boston, or moves to Brookline, particularly because of his commission for the Boston Park System, or if we lovingly refer to it as the Emerald Necklace.
Which he never did, right? He never referred to it as the Emerald Necklace.
He never did. You want to know his suggestion? You know it?
Yeah.
You want to share it?
The Emerald Girdle.
No, the jeweled girdle.
Jeweled girdle.
The jeweled girdle. Nobody took that on. It became the Emerald Necklace instead. But later on in his career, so by the time he moves to Brookline, he's in his 60s, but he's really trying to figure out what's next for him. And the Emerald Necklace represents a great diversity of projects all in this one little place. So he writes that that his partners should decline any business that stands in the way of doing the best for Boston all the time. Really focus on how this park system will improve the conditions of society, because early Boston, it's just this right here. And in 1870, about 3 years before he's even hired to come into Boston, he writes that Boston is a mere nucleus of the Boston to be. And so Boston itself started to grow physically by fill, taking down the hills and actually growing out. So the Back Bay is all fill, but also by annexation and taking over neighborhoods that were already there. So unlike New York City, which was confined very much to the space that they had, especially Manhattan is an island, can't get the city much bigger. That's where it's going to be. Boston was growing. And so for Olmsted, looking at how he could design the Boston Park System to fan out much further than that original core of Boston, and particularly with Franklin Park. But as we move through the Emerald Necklace, as I said, it's a variety of projects. Olmsted's first hired as a sanitary project for the Back Bay Fens, which was the muddiest, foulest marsh in the city. Turning it from a sanitary project, doing some work on the Muddy River. For those of you who might have been to Boston recently, they have daylighted the Muddy River. They have brought it back to the ground. You can actually see it in the 50s, 60s, they put it underground. Paved over it, created parking lots and roadways. Jamaica Pond naturally occurring. Olmsted's like, we don't have to do anything to it. Look how beautiful it is. Just put a path around it and we're good. Checked up, put it off the list. And then this idea of parkways. So the Arbor Way, moving people through the space so that you don't have to experience stress, so that this is an opportunity for people, the bridle path versus the walking path versus the road in this space. The Arboretum itself, which was already underway, but kind of sucked into the Boston Park system. It was managed by Harvard. The city owns the property and leases it back to Harvard for $1 a year for a 1,000-year lease. I want to know what's going to happen in year 1,000. Like, who's going to renegotiate that contract? Like, I'm very curious. And then Franklin Park. And so if we look at Central Park as kind of Olmsted's like, I don't know, can I try this? Can I do this? What are we thinking? Prospect Park is really him finding his feet. And then Franklin Park is kind of thinking to the next generation, these big urban green spaces in Franklin Park. Olmsted talks about this pleasing rural scenery away from the bustle and jar of the streets, an opportunity to have pleasure or benefit without conscious exertion. You can just go and enjoy. And so Franklin Park is a reflection of what was happening in society at the time. As Boston is growing, as people have access to transportation, streetcars are moving people throughout, you're not as locked to your location. And this goes across classes, because when Olmsted's designing in New York, the only people who could afford to leave New York are the people who had a lot of money and had summer homes and could get out of the city during those health crises. Franklin Park in Boston, Olmsted's realizing that people have better access to transportation across all classes. And so how do you create something where people want to make a destination of a park instead of just something that you would use on a daily basis, of which people do as well. And so this idea that you can escape the city, move out to someplace like Franklin Park and have this same experience, those big open spaces. The wilderness is up on the top. That's kind of like the Ramble in Central Park, a more formal greeting area, this destination of a landscape. But Olmsted is doing this work, particularly with the Emerald Necklace, as he's training the next generation. So as you have the expanse looking out into Franklin Park and looking at what's next, you have these big view sheds. What's beyond that? So his two sons, John Charles Olmsted up top, Frederick Olmsted Jr., and then Charles Eliot, who's my favorite Olmsted, but don't tell anybody that. He's not an Olmsted, but he's my favorite Olmsted. They think that the old man, senior, is thinking too small. Things are growing and they're growing at a rapid pace. And so as Senior retires in 1895, his two sons, John Charles and Jr., take over the business and create Olmsted Brothers. The Olmsted Brothers is probably the most successful era of the firm. Anthony will talk about that in a little bit. Right. Yeah. And this is when they are doing the most work on the biggest scale. So Eliot, Olmsted's early partner, doesn't think that he's thinking big enough with the Emerald Necklace. And so he proposes two separate regional and then turns into statewide park systems. So the older map is of the proposed Metropolitan Parks Commission. Can you point out the Emerald Necklace?
So that little bit.
That's just the Emerald Necklace. And then if you look at the green space and the orange spots that are selected, those are ones that Eliot proposed to be part of the Metropolitan Parks Commission, because Eliot was like, parks don't end at city boundaries. The impacts of parks don't end at city boundaries. So thinking regionally is incredibly important. Understanding that the Blue Hills is going to go over 4 or 5 towns, and how do you have these towns work together to create these places? He wanted to have a circle of parks outside of the city, 10 miles as the crow flies, of, he referenced it, uniquely New England landscapes. So you have Nantasket and Revere Beach, you have Middlesex Fells, and then you have Blue Hills. And so this was his answer to the problem that he saw, that we were growing too quickly and that people needed better access. Eliot also was one of the founders of the Trustees of Reservations, because he thought that as people donate to libraries and donate to art museums, why wouldn't people naturally donate to a land trust? Why wouldn't you have the ability to have access to green space just as much as you have access to books? And so Eliot argues that there's just as much value in that, which is where the Trustees of Reservations starts from. but they're also looking bigger. Cities are well developed, they're well designed. We're in the early 1900s. And so they're just now, what do we do with them? And so Junior in particular, especially once his brother passes away and he takes hold of Olmsted Brothers, city planning becomes the focus, because the condition of society, how they can be useful, city planning is what they can do. The Los Angeles Metropolitan Plan, the Bartholomew Plan for LA, was something that Olmsted Jr. worked heavily on. LA was very populous. LA was very poorly planned. I used to live in LA, it's still very poorly planned. They didn't take Olmsted's proposal, but understanding that this regional planning was what's next, what else they could do. And then even on a larger scale, the California State Park System. Junior spends about 3 years going up and down the coast of California, all throughout, to basically set up the California Park State System, creating a register of what should or should not be included in the first state park system in the nation. So this idea of thinking bigger, of figuring out what that is, but on the flip side of that, because everything, those large public projects were done, a lot of their work transforms into private. So public buildings, private estates, schools, college campuses, that sort of thing, especially during the Olmsted Associates era. So after Junior's death in the late 1950s, they reincorporate to Olmsted Associates, and their focus primarily becomes Massachusetts and primarily becomes those private clients and less of those public works, because that's not what's coming to them and what's needed at the time. So when the National Park Service takes over the site in 1980, it was really unique, not only because of Olmsted Senior's connection to Yosemite, but it was at Frederick Olmsted National Historic Site, or Fairstead, that Junior was asked to write the mission statement for the Organic Act in 1916, which created us as an agency. So in our North Parlor, first room you walk into is where Olmsted Jr. Sat to write what he talked about as the heart of the language of why we are an agency today, and this idea of conserving scenery for the enjoyment of this generation and all future generations. And at that time, this is how he was thinking he could be useful for this broader brush of society.
Just one on that, to think about that, initially creating parks became creating park systems. Like there was this sort of metastasized, now not just the Emerald Necklace, but now the Metropolitan District Commission, and not just within Boston, but all the trustees of reservations, and not just the California State Parks. Like, so there was this escalating and thinking bigger and bigger and bigger, that the planning of this park isn't a one and done. There is a growing, how do people use it? How do people use a California State Park system? And then sort of the ultimate is looking at the national park system. How do people use it? How are they going to access it? What is our careful management of this stuff? They weren't looking at just Yosemite or just Yellowstone or just Acadia. As a system, how do we manage these lands in the interest of the public?
And he has to throw in there, which I appreciate, the historic objects, because people think Yellowstone and Yosemite, we're national park, we got the badge. But I think this idea, and it really echoes his father's, this idea of the condition of society, future generations, what that means, nobody knows. It's kind of this like open, like, okay, we're gonna do it this way. And so I think that's where, we as stewards of these places try and look at what is needed now. How can we be helpful and useful now with what we have been given with managing Fairstead? So one of the ways that we are useful, well, you're useful, I don't do this, but ish.
Fairstead, the Olmsted Homestead. The Park Service, the National Park Service acquired the site in Brookline in 1979-80. And what was significant about the many historic buildings are taken in by the Park Service also, but fairly rarely is specifically talked about in the legislation, the congressional legislation. The house, the grounds, the archival collection was specifically called out as an inherently important part of the history of Fairstead. It wasn't always considered as inherently important because, again, the Park Service, we don't know what the heck to do with a huge archival collection. We can count moose, we try to keep people out of geyser, but archives is not really our bag. That's not so much. maybe Harvard wants all that stuff, and Harvard was like, oh, no, thank you, we do not want that. So we took it on, in 1980, and even at the later, so as the firm reincorporated as the Olmsted Associates, the Park Service acquired the site. They were actually active at the site until 1979, when we acquired the site and the collections. Even at that time, the belly of the work, as we were talking about, the Olmsted brothers really saw that crest of their business in the 1920s. 1929, this little fiscal thing happens and the stock market crashes. And really, the last thing people have money for is gardens. It's not like, so that becomes a critical factor. How the firm crested 1920s. We see the big belly of the collection in that time.
Can I say
And
that?
off.
Unlike his father, Junior is a very smart and savvy politician. So if you ever look at Civilian Conservation Corps or other WPA projects that were happening during the Great Depression, a lot of them that have landscape components were tossed to the brothers. Olmsted Junior is very well connected in DC. So a lot of CCC, WPA, that type of work that has any sort of landscape, you'll see like an Olmsted Brothers tagline on it.
And we really see the increase of the professionalization of the office and also the professionalization of the profession. That Olmsted Senior worked sort of on his own. He helped start the industry. I'm quite sure that's fair, but he was the big daddy of landscape architecture. The brothers incorporated and really hired loads of people, systematized the records creation, the construction of the firm, physically the office grew and sort of metastasized as their business. So you really see this business development of the brothers as they took over from a one-man shop and then a one-man and his son's shop into the Olmsted Brothers Landscape Architects. As that, John Charles died in 1920, Olmsted Senior dies in 1903 after 5 years of retirement and claims. So he is no longer with the firm. Biltmore Estate is probably his last big major, the World's Columbian Exposition. He goes into retirement after 1898. The brothers really take on the firm. And with John Charles' death in 1920, and then Junior's death, retirement in the 50s, and death in 1957, the firm reincorporates as Olmsted Associates and then operates Olmsted Associates Inc. from 1961, I believe, to when the Park Service acquired the site. Again, so when the Park Service acquired the site, it came with this sort of mother load of 139,000 architectural plans, 60,000 photographs, reams and reams of correspondence. The firm had actually donated their historic correspondence, 1885 to 1950, to the Library of Congress. So that material was there. We maintained a collection of correspondence from 1949 to 1979. So it's split a little bit as researchers need to see both the whole collection. It's a little bit of a split thing. As we acquired the site, it was a rat's nest. It was a literal, I don't think I included, but maybe there's historic photos of what the brick vault that is attached to the firm, to the office looks like. And it is just a series of cubby holes with plans rolled tight, jammed in there and falling apart. So we acquired the site, we acquired the collections we need to do better with this. So on the left side, is what the vault looks like today. In the 1990s, it was retrofitted with modern shelving and HVAC and humidity controls. And again, in the later days of the Olmsted firm, they weren't doing a whole lot of landscape architecture anymore, but they were doing a lot of sort of the reference work that we carry on today. People were coming to them for a new design. We know you designed our land back in 1923. Can you get the plans? We could do it for you. We're like, no, you're good. We don't want new work. We just want the records of them. So that their business was definitely petering out by the 1960s, 70s. So we acquired the site. We acquired the researchers that have been using our resources for like gangbusters, doing restorations of historic landscapes, doing preservation of green spaces, sometimes development of green spaces. We will see all researchers. We don't discriminate. We'll help the people who are trying to preserve a site. We're more helpful than those who are trying to destroy green space. But yeah, we serve all. In the upper right, you see two researchers, Arlene Levy and Elliot Foulds, are sort of Olmsted rock stars. And we, for probably 30 years, researchers would come to us and take a look at the plans, and we'd unroll them sometimes. And 2 days later, someone else would want to see that, so we'd unroll that plan again. And some of these are very fine trace paper, onion skins. Some are hardy blueprints and lithographs. So it's a variety of collections that people want to see. And we were doing that for a good number of years before digitization came along. And initially, we would make copies. If someone, back in the day, if someone wanted a copy of that, we would run it through the machine and print a same size paper copy, and we'd roll it up and we'd mail it off to them.
You sound like such a grandpa right
Don't
now.
I?
Oh, back in the day.
I had to walk 3 miles to digitize it. So that changed when the electronic came on, we would make the copy, but keep a sort of 1990s version of a digital file. And then when someone wanted that copy again, we'd just print off again to that digital file. Well, eventually people stopped wanting paper copies. So at this point, they just wanted the digital file. Over the years, we got so you see my colleague Michelle standing in a scanner. It's about 56 inches wide, and we feed plans through and it captures the digital file. We process it into a JPEG and everything. We post it online. So it's all of it. So of 139,000 architectural plans and drawings, we're about 92% done.
You upped that last time we did this, you said 86.
I know.
You guys are-
We're busy.
You're busy.
And part of that is because we don't have researchers wanting to come and see this stuff anymore. We have more time just to make them as like, just keep scanning. And at the point where if it's not scanned, we actually pre-COVID even, we were seeing pretty close to 0 researchers come into our facility. Because if someone doesn't have to come in from California or Tokyo, if we can just say, we're gonna scan it to you, put it on our website, you'll find it that way. It's really shifted the way we've been doing our work. That it's almost not, so we kept stats of how many people cross our threshold, which is what Congress really looks at for our numbers. We have tanked, like our visitorship has gone to 0 almost. Meanwhile, we're getting a couple 100,000 page views on our Flickr page a month. So, which we haven't quite figured out how to make that metric more, like, we're still working, trust us, but it becomes this, the researchers are finding this material on Google and from other sources that we don't have to broker that relationship. The downside is that if it's not on the internet to some generations today, it doesn't exist. So as we're scanning stuff, there's still a bunch of stuff that won't be scanned soon or ever. And some researchers kind of do a full stop of like, well, it's not on your Flickr site. So no, we have a lot more. Come ask us about that. Right now we have a scholar who's looking at Olmsted Jr.'s travel logbook of the photographs he was taking in the 1890s. And that material has never been looked at before. So it's kind of exciting. We have scholars every now and then doing that. How they find our materials, we have an online database called Orgo, the Olmsted Research Guide Online. And it is a place to search both for the Olmsted master list, which is their project list. You can type in the client's name at the time of, it obviously won't have your name there if the client was Jackson back in the 1920s. You can search on communities or project types. There's sort of other robust ways to do advanced searches to find, I want to find the Montpelier private estates that you have plans for. So there's a couple different ways to do research with Orgo. Search results. And once we get to, so what has been digitized has been loaded to Flickr. I have a difficult relationship with digital. I'm a paper person. I love books. But we've been saddled with digital, so we're all in on now. And Flickr is what my mom used to use for her travel. Like she would go to Puerto Rico and put her photos. That is what we use for research access. People ask, so what does Harvard do and what's Library of Congress do? We're like, well, if we were Harvard or Library of Congress, would be using very different things. We are not. So we are using the sort of very popular, very available Flickr site, and people love it. We do have the ability that people can download and they can upload, and it's sort of locked down. So there is that. Let's come back to that. So we'll look at that a little closer in a couple minutes, not a whole lot. And then more recently, we've also done this mapping project that we're going to look at for where to look at it visually, of looking at a map of the US. It used to be when I first started back in the 19th century, we wanted to do a map on the wall, put the pins where all the Olmsted projects were. But then if you look at Brookline, it just, you'd have 50,000 pins in one very little. Digital has made that a lot easier to where you can zoom in and zoom out. So we're going to take that. So I'd encourage you to take a look at our website as a site. The Orgo site is there as a search option.
I can move that to the side.
I've known that before. Sorry, y'all.
What's the website called again?
It's called the Olmsted Research Guide Online, Orgo. And so if you go to our website, Frederick Olmsted National Historic Site, you can access all these resources from our parks page.
Archives has its own little tab right
That's
there, right there.
That's right. Oh, look, it's gone. I see. So our Flickr page is where we are loading all of these images, and as researchers come to us, they want to see the oversized plans, which are kind of a bear to handle, but there they are. The photograph albums that the Olmsted firm kept documentation as a good business of their before, during, and after. So a lot of times it was the landscape before the Olmsteds even touched it. Work in progress, and then the final photo, sometimes professionally shot by landscape photographers. So right now we have, I want to say, over 200,000 images, given the photograph albums and the plans, and that's where we are for now. So we'll go to right. So the Olmsted job numbers are sort of luckily, as a librarian, I didn't have to come up with anything. The Olmsted firm maintained this job numbering system, and we've only maintained that as the operating way to go. So when a researcher comes to the particular project, we look at the plans and drawings, the photo albums, and any lithographs and any other materials that are available. So this is kind of again, it goes to where we only digitize so much. We would rather people come to us and find out what else hasn't been digitized. We can help. If it's not digitized, we can scan it for them, and then it goes into the bank so that the next person doesn't have to bother us. I'd mentioned the GIS process. This is it, and you can also find this from our website. And I've gotten to different ways to look on the map. I've looked at Wayano, and it's hard to see, but the little dots are all color coded. So the purple one, light purples are private estates. The orange ones, I think, are country clubs. So the Wayano Club was done in the 1930s and 1940s and 47. This also links to that Flickr page, so that takes you directly to the resources that are available for any project. So this is sort of our wonderful community that we are here. Once we start zooming out, we see the real breadth of the work that was done. And you see sort of hotspots of, well, look at all that in the Fall River area. And then we start getting to Boston, and we start seeing huge clusters of, and then even on the nationwide level, seeing where these clusters are. There's a lot of work in the DC area. The greens are actually the national park sites, so it's a bit of a preloaded opportunity, but
In Western Massachusetts.
Western Mass.
There's almost no further west even. What's going on there?
Again, so this is the sort of thing that visually we can look at, that a lot of the light purple are the private estates. So we see these sort of clusters, and if we go out, and Fisher's Island has this huge cluster of very nice estates. And Long Island, the sort of north coast of Long Island, also you start seeing where these clusters of private estates are. Looking at the orange, you can see the school systems, like a lot of the Alabama schools. And again, there was this period where we had talked about that the park systems development of the late 19th, early 20th kind of morphs into where the business was going in the City Beautiful, in the private estates, in the Long Island mansions were being built, Newport, they did a lot of work there. So you kind of see where this, and then it shifts to the city planning, urban planning. They're still doing some private estates, not so much. And then by the mid-century, Olmsted Associates are really kind of doing make work. Like their shine has kind of gone off a little bit. One of our biggest projects is Ole Miss, the University of Mississippi, that we have 1,600 plans in the archives for it, which was never implemented because they wanted to, the university wanted to do, they needed to do a long range development plan, and we can get that famous name Olmsted attached to it. We can get a little money off of that, they'll fund it, right? And then, so there was a lot of work generated from the office in the 1960s on that was never implemented. It was boondoggle doesn't seem like the right term. It was a business decision. It was a choice to bring work in.
I also think that there's a really big backlash against the Olmsted design aesthetic in the 60s and 70s because of like the brutalistic modern architecture that was very trendy of the time, and like the modern, like that's the complete opposite of what Olmsted ever would have argued for. And so the shine's worn off because they're still doing like, oh, they're doing the old way of landscape architecture. Like that's, and so there's also just this like societal pushback against like, oh, That's cute, but you're old
I
fashioned.
think there is, but I think by the fifties and sixties, Archivist Richardson and Joe Hudak, some of the partners that survived the actual named Olmsteds, that were Olmsted Associates. Again, a lot of their aesthetic, there was a lot of concrete design, and
Yeah.
there's a lot of, so this mid-century, I'm kind of praying for that mid-century modern moment that the Olmsted Associates are gonna have their time and see some of there's a lot of ugly designs. And I said, so for the 139,000 architectural plans we have, a lot of those are multiple copies of elevations and really boring stuff. And the profiling section shows the topographical change. I don't get a lot out of that. I don't understand that. But landscape architects love that because of the documentation of the topography of the land they can really use. Again, I'm not a genius. I don't get it, but they love it. We'll stand for it. I tend towards more the watercolor paintings and the sort of presentation drawings and pretty gardens. And I think that's,
We didn't even mention, so of the projects, starting with Central Park in 1857 through 1980, when the firm left the office. The Olmsted name, under whatever name, is credited with 6,000 landscape designs, throughout the United States and a few international projects as well, so. Good chunk of work.
and there's a little bit of a.
6,000.
There's a little bit of an epilogue too. So when we acquired the site in 1979-80, the last partner, Archivist Richardson, kind of got screwed on the deal, but he was able to take the name and keep working, and he operated as the Olmsted Office Inc. in New Hampshire. And in 2000, the year 2000, we got a letter from him saying, closing up shop, we're done, the Olmsted name is no longer in practice. And he was able to take some materials with him, which we've never gotten back again, which we're not sure about a little bit. And he sent back the letter, and he sent back the Olmsted tomb key at the Hartford, Connecticut cemetery. Like, why the heck do you have the Olmsted tomb key? What's in it? Is that where you kept the plans? So there is this little, like, finally in 2000, from after 100 years.
Yeah.
It was an operation, for better or worse, wasn't great by the end, but at least, and to that, where researchers come to us and they're interested in the sexy projects, the beautiful projects. We even have historic documents of many projects that aren't super Olmstedian in the classic, but to us, they're all our special little babies that we take care of, so.
I love them all equally.
Yeah, I think that's all we have, and time for questions.
I have a question. Did that include like sustainable farming, and did he tie that back into some of his architecture plans?
So of the time that, it's kind of hard, so, it's a hard question. I will say, like, when Olmsted Senior is doing Stanford University, so Leland Stanford Junior University, he's working for the Stanford family, and they want Harvard of the West. That is, they want ivy covered buildings, like that is what they're going for, brick and Olmsted is like, there is no way your climate can sustain these types of plans, like it's just not what they have. And so he really pushes them towards the more Mediterranean style that Stanford embraced. On the flip side of that, San Francisco wanted their own Central Park with Golden Gate Park. That was something that they were really looking for. Come to the Olmsted. And again, the Olmsted said, you cannot sustain that much green space, and because of your water, consumption and all of that kind of stuff. And so San Francisco said, okay, great. And they hired someone else. So they don't necessarily have, like, it's not that was something that was end goal, but it was something they were aware of. Olmsted very often gets slammed in Boston with the Muddy River project in particular, because Phragmites, familiar with Phragmites, the reeds that grow uncontrollably, Olmsted planted them. But hold on, Phragmites can only grow in a certain salinity of water. So at the time that Olmsted was designing, the Charles River was still tidal and still pulling in some salt water. So there was a natural control on Phragmites because it wasn't just fresh water. The second the Charles was dammed, Phragmites took over because it was all fresh water. And it was like, all right, great, like it can grow everywhere. So they're aware of these things, but as an end goal, it wasn't something that they ever at least mentioned in their designs.
And I will say also the sort of climate and regionalism, Olmsted Junior did a lot of work in Florida and like Wales, the private estates there. And there was an awareness that what was appropriate for some areas would not, like they did a lot of palm trees and a lot of what would have been appropriate for that. In other wintry areas, they were still planting a whole lot of plants that might not have been. And we see that in the record. We see what failed and what needed to be replaced. Their conversations with the nursery folk. So you always kind of see what their process was through the records.
Yeah, I just, you mentioned the Biltmore, so I was thinking of how they did their farming.
Yep.
things
I
like
think that
too, and-
Biltmore is
and
probably a unique experience of the scientific forestry that they were very involved with. I'll say Gruber, that's not right.
You go your mind.
So there was a German forester that they worked very closely with, and it was the Biltmore.
Yeah.
And also Biltmore was the first, so Olmsted convinces the Vanderbilts to donate part of their land to the new Forest Service, like the federal agency, and so worked with Gifford Pinchot, who was the first director of the Forest Service, to establish the National Forest sits right next to Biltmore, and that was original Vanderbilt property as well. So that like scientific forestry, but also preservation of forest, like there's a
Land
lot of,
conservation.
land conservation. They had a lot going on in the Biltmore.
Shelburne Farm, actually, they copied the model from Shelburne Farm, so they were, while I was there, which I was in Vermont, which I
Credit-
was
credit
really
where it's due.
Yeah,
interesting, you know, so it's 6,000.
it's a big number.
And one last bit on that, the 6,000 projects are carried out or not. So not everything that's on the paper is on the land.
So like we have plans for Golden Gate Park.
And
That's not
so,
what's there.
and so researchers might come to us and say, I know that I live on an Olmsted property, and we have to kind of maybe talk them down sometimes, like, well, it might have been an Olmsted project that was done in 1958, that's not that pretty. Or it's an Olmsted project only in as much as the firm was consulted, quoted a price, and the client was like, oh, yeah, no. we're not doing that. So there, anywhere along the design process, it might have actually made it to creation. Even if it didn't, or if it's been completely bulldozed, we still consider that. We are never in any place to say that's still Olmstedian, that is looking pretty sharp. As a federal government, no one wants to hear from us and our opinion on, so the National Association of Farms and Parks, now the Olmsted Network, is that right? Is an advocacy group for the Olmsted landscapes that are out in the world, and so they can run defense for all that. We absolutely cannot. But it becomes more of an academic, whether it was built or not, we have the records. And if you want to, if it was never done in 1920s because it was too expensive, you can do it now and it won't cost you anything. But there is this idea that of the 6,000, we get questions every now and then. Well, how many are Olmsted Senior? I don't know. I couldn't say. How many were actually built? Even further, I don't even know. So there's a little bit of that tug of what is Olmstedian, what's still extant, what was actually built. And those are all great researcher questions. Research it.
I was wondering, that I've been to the site, and the site itself is in a very interesting area in Brookline, residential, and some beautiful old mansions and things like that. And I was wondering how the business came to be located there. Did the Olmsteds live nearby? Did they ever occupy the building where you are now?
They did, so they, I have the honor of having my office in Olmsted's bathroom. It's not a bathroom anymore, but, so Olmsted moves his family to Brookline and takes over the North Parlor as the first office in that space, and then expands the office from there, but that is a family home with office right next to it. This is pre-zoning, like you would never allow a business in that neighborhood today, never.
The neighbors sure would.
And so when Olmsted moves to Brookline, one of the couple of reasons he moves there is because his good friend H.H. Richardson, architect, lives just around the corner, and so he's really drawn to it because he has a really good friend there. But also, and he notes it, that he's struck with Brookline's generosity, because when he was accepting packages as part of the Sanitary Commission, he noted that a lot of them came from Brookline, so he thought that like this was a community that he could get behind. And so his majority of work was happening in Boston, and he just thought it would be easier to move the family. He's getting, a little bit older, and that travel isn't as and probably not as enjoyable anymore to head from New York to Boston. But the family is there. The family is there until Mary moves out. Junior and John Charles have their own homes in the neighborhood. The office continues there. At some point, though, there's a wall up, and the house is rented out to people who have nothing to do with the firm. Like, they are connected. There's just a wall between them. But when Olmsted Brothers took over the property, they repackaged it as a business and as offering so they could rent it out. And then Archivist Richardson, the last partner, did live there with his family as well. So it kind of has this weird in between home office. Again, Olmsted never really separates himself from his work, so it just worked for him, I guess.
And as you take a tour, so the site is open for tours by rangers. Currently, we're closed for the season, but we offer tours.
Email me, you can still come.
You know what happened. But you really see where the house sort of stops and where that historic drafting wing starts, and it really grew as the firm grew, this metastasization. As landscape architects, they were not very good architects. Like, it's just a jumble of turns and stairs, and it's just horribly designed. But you do kind of see there were, by 1900, the vault was built. 10 years later, they needed a second story, so they raised the roof and put another level in. So it really kind of grew as the firm grew. Not planned, but it functioned.
If you go online and ask for projects in a particular location, can you actually click on one of those dots to see what the project is?
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
a good one.
Sure.
Can I click on
requests.
anyone?
Taking requests.
Anyone have a request?
That was something right here in
Page
page one. Yeah.
Zoom you in.
Okay.
So if I was just gonna flip one around. So even if you click any one of these guys. So subdivision. And then you click on that, and that takes you to the plans and drawings of that. Then you click on those and you can scroll to see what was created.
So on the map initially, it's just hovering over, you'll see what the project is, and then you get a little card of what kind of project it was, what the date range of the plans are, and then the link to the Flickr page that if you, and so in our discussion of this, we would love to have seen, the 1885 plan for the house of the, and as I was kind of buzzing through, oh, that was done in 1940s, that was done in 1930s. Wayano Club, again, done in the 1940s and 50s. So there's some beautiful watercolor, again, as a, if one likes the Olmsted Senior. I don't think Olmsted Senior came to Cape Cod. So it's a tough to say, what the Olmsted influence of this area, what the neighborhood was. As we were discussing the sort of growth of, we look at Newport and the summer mansions there for the rich. And then we look at the sort of 20s when the upper middle class maybe had the capital to build a summer home on a cape, or we see these smaller projects that are still lovely and are Olmstedian, but they aren't the grandiose. It's not Biltmore, it's not Elms, but it's, the Jackson Place, which there might be not 300 plans, but there might be 7 really great plans and a whole bunch of doodles and sketches, noodling through the plan problems. And so again, whether it's informative to, whether it's Olmstedian in its ideal, or whether the homeowner wants to say, oh my God, they thought about putting a rock walkway over there also back in 1920, we should do that now. So there's a couple different reasons why people would contact us for this, or even academic, like if someone is looking at what the Olmsted influence in the Lower Cape was, you'd start looking at this stuff like, no one came here after 1930, or no one, it's Olmsted Associates only, and that's kind of interesting.
I'm curious about, what seniors' bedside manner was like, where it's like, was he actually like really close friends with some of his clients? Because I actually just went to Biltmore, a few weeks ago, and there's this beautiful, humongous portrait of him in one of the like 15 family living rooms, in the home, and that just really struck me as pretty rare. Like I've never been to like a historic home like that or something where they had a portrait of a symphony offender.
It's their contractor.
And painted by no less than John Singer Sargent, right?
Yeah.
Is the other thing, like, this is not a small bit that like, holy cow, what was he doing for you then? I think that was a probably unusual relationship. I mean, not in any creepy way, but I think it was not a typical. And I think, the bedside manner of Olmsted Senior, he sounded like a cranky guy, like, and one of his friends talks about him surviving through the Civil War on little sleep and breakfasting on coffee and pickles, which just makes him sound even worse. Like he just was not. He was underslept and he was smelling of coffee. And in looking in sort of retro, he had manic, like he worked like a dog. And then he had these periods of black funk that just took him to bed for days at a time. So in this idea that he had tinnitus and he had a bum leg and he worked like a crazy man. I mean, sorry, not a crazy man. He worked like a real hardworking fella. And so there are questions. And we have very little, at the Fairstead site, we have very little information about Olmsted Senior himself. We have the business records of the firm and we'll go all day on that. The Library of Congress has the personal papers of Olmsted Senior, and that's where to do biographical research, really well, Library of Congress is a place for that. But we we have so much on the business workings and the political and social commentary, and we don't have a lot on what their family life was like. We don't have that social history. We don't have that, what was really, there's, I don't know if there's actual, but there's speculation about how happy the boys were to go into the family business. Like, did they really want to be landscape architects? No.
I mean, I don't, that's my, get personal
But the
opinion.
vibe
But
is-
when you think about how his father provided everything for him and like was just like, what do you want to do? Like, I'll fund it all. Like, it was not a question for the boys. Like, I started this profession, I am doing this, and you're right along with me. Like, there is nothing, like, to the point where he sends John Charles to England to take a walking tour for himself. And John Charles writes him letters, and there's some pretty harsh writing back to him, being like, you're not doing it right. Like, you are not serious about this. Like, you need to, and I'm just like, what did you do? Like,
Right. You gave Grandpa Olmsted, he gave you all kinds of stuff.
so like, so I do think the Vanderbilts are a particular one at Biltmore. I think that, you know, he definitely had a relationship. He's well regarded while he's at Biltmore. He's also doing the Chicago's World's Fair, and Daniel Burnham, who's the architect and the overall designer of that, in the opening speech, like kicking off the opening of the fair, just gives all of the accolades. Like, none of it could be possible without Olmsted. And so I think that he's well regarded professionally, but I do think that there's a little bit of a personality. But he also, as you can see in some of his experiences, like, he's kind of the kid who's like, well, fine, I'm taking my ball and going home. Like, you're not going to play the right way. Like, I don't want to play with you anymore. Like, he just leaves a lot of things if it's not going his way. So again, I'm very jealous of our colleagues at the Longfellow House in Cambridge, because Fanny Longfellow was a diary keeper. And so, like, you know, every day, like, what those kids ate, like, you know, what her husband was doing, like, you know, everything about their life. And Mary and her, you know, the son, like, they're just not those people. So we don't have that insight. So it's all speculation, but you can just kind of see from the writings where some of that could go. Fun fact, did they tell you about the portrait and the head and the body?
They like took it like right in the front porch and then like basically screened it.
And so the head was Senior, but he was so old and so frail at that point that he couldn't stand for the whole portrait. So Junior puts his dad's clothes on and stands for the rest of the portrait. So once Senior's head is done, he heads out, and Junior like literally takes on his father's.
The metaphors.
Yeah,
Make themselves.
they do.
Well, and even so, Junior, for the first 5 years of his life, was not named Frederick Olmsted Jr. He was 6 years old when his father renamed him Frederick Olmsted Jr. In this, like, what can only be an ego, like, my legacy will live on as my son. You used to be Harry Perkins, you are now Junior. You're not my real dad.
But at the same time, I mean, Senior dies in 1903. The bank records that Junior sends to change his name and drop the Junior. So I don't think that he hated it, because he didn't even wait 2 years for his dad to die. And he's like, I don't want to be called Junior anymore. So he goes professionally by Frederick Olmsted 2 years after. So people are like, oh, something designed by Frederick Olmsted and it's 1931. I'm like, Junior. Like, no, it says, I'm like, right, I get that. He was not 100 years old when he did that plan.
Designing for beyond.
Right, exactly.
Did they end up doing that 10-mile ring outside of Boston?
Yes, so the Metropolitan Parks Commission was established, and then that speaks to what is now DCR. So it has its roots in the Metropolitan Parks Commission, and then Department of Conservation and Recreation is that in the state. They just absorbed it into the state park system.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Maybe last one?
What kind of computer horsepower do you have working for you? The reason I ask is I have worked in the Geological Survey and was told we scan the seafloor and came back for many, many years with paper records that we pushed under the scanner.
Yeah.
You know, what kind of a product do you get in the end, and how do you deal with these scans? Obviously, you've got all kinds of skills that make it work.
Whoa.
Your skills, look at
Thank you. That's nice. I think, and secondarily, like, we, as much as the Park Service probably didn't want to acquire the archives in the first place, but we did because we had to. We probably, the scanning makes it easier for us to deal with our researchers, but we kept going to Washington, like, tell us how to do this. Get your digital czar to tell us how to manage this. And they were kind of like, well, we don't really know. Let us know what you do, and we might cycle. So there, I think the Park Service does really well what it does. A lot of the GIS information, a lot of the biological information, like, those are crunching numbers like crazy. Specifically within the Park Service, the museum nerds don't really, like, that's not the water we swim in mostly. So I think at Olmsted, we really kind of stumbled our way through a 3-quarter project, not making a whole lot of mistakes. And it's tough to say what the future, what the legacy of that, like that, to do it all over again. We just started scanning ad hoc for the researchers without creating a program and a project and moving forward with the right protocols. So that gets nerdy fast, but like we just started doing because we had to, instead of having like an actual project meeting to say, what are our outcomes, and now we're left with this data that we have to maintain forever and migrate forever. So there's a whole lot of things that we haven't done through, mostly because it's not our world. And we are gonna have to manage this. And people say, so what does it cost to come do the research? Well, I used to say it's free, except that taxpayers already, so your tax dollars are paying for our time, you're paying for the work that's going on. And honestly, I don't wanna have a huge server crash and lose all of this stuff that y'all paid us to do. So there's a little bit of concern about the data preservation that so it's not gonna, if the server crashes, we have a backup out of Springfield. So we do have some preservation stuff. It's not the robust, doing automatic checks of the files and stuff like that we should be. And someone pointed out, well, what happens if like the entire eastern seaboard, Springfield to Brookline, gets wiped out? I got a lot of bigger problems. That happens. But the idea that if something catastrophic happens to our server, Springfield, if there's a sinkhole that opens up and we lose all those plans, at least they're on Flickr. Like, at least there is some digital preservation by default. Like, if we lose everything, we've loaded them to the web, to a third party. Flickr is not a government, like we are at the behest of, and they almost went under a couple years ago. We were like, oh, crud, what do we do? So there's all this thinking that we are just, paddling as fast as we can for the ducks that have looking serene on top of it. There's a lot of thinking we need to do about the future preservation of this. We put so much into the preservation, the cleaning and the catalog and the plans. It was a 15-year project to get them flattened, conserved, cataloged, beautiful. We kind of need to take the same tack on the digital files and manage those as we do. But again, it's not a lot of people have thought down that road of like, holy cow, what happens if? Oh, that's not.
Well, a lot of people think once you do it digital, why keep the original?
Oh, no, just keeping the original.
Yeah.
Because you have to keep it under certain conditions and everything, have to stay.
Forever, like once, and that's the thing about taking stuff in the Park Service, and any good museum says, we will take your donation of your loving newspaper scrapbooks. We are taking that and under the responsibility, you're entrusting the American government with these collections, and we will take it in and care for it in perpetuity. So we want to be very careful about what donations we take in, what lands the Park Service takes in. If we don't have the capacity, this is my soapbox. If we don't have the capability to be caring for lands that we are taking in, give us more staff, not you guys. But there is a concern about taking in more historic sites, more lands. Katahdin is a huge piece of land that we are now managing forever.
I told you, we just got 2 new ones yesterday. Got up to 425.
Ice Age.
Ice Age National Scenic Trail, now managed by the National Park Service. It was added yesterday.
It's very cold though, I hear.
Uh-huh.
So I think we could probably run well over.
Yeah.
Thank
Thank you
you
so
all for-
much.